what kind of communities we can represent, what kind of non-human entities, nature, rivers, you name it, that we can represent as well, and how all of this could feed into the ways we can think about policy alternatives or decisions and how they may affect us. So there are a few principles for it, but one of them is that the quality of the communication we're having should be inclusive, and this can be of all those affected and those who may be affected in the future by it. It should be authentic, meaning that it shouldn't be manipulative, and it shouldn't coerce or force people into certain priorities or interests. It should connect the particular with the general, the private with the public, and generally aspire to have a common good through these communications. And finally, that it's consequential, that it should have an impact, it should be linked to policy, law, decision, etc. This might sound too idealistic to achieve, and that's absolutely fair if you have this idea running through your head. And theorists have tackled this problem of division of labor in so many different ways. I'm happy to talk about it later, it's so long to get into it now. But it's definitely an interesting part of the theory. But then at the same time, the difference between deliberative democracy and electoral democracy is that so deliberative democracy wants citizens to hold people accountable, power holders accountable. There is always a requirement of communication that goes both ways, communication that goes between the policymakers, the elected officials, and to citizens, but as well as for enabling citizens to have the space in which they could transfer these communications directly to policymakers. And this is primarily through this focus on the role of justification. Maybe decision makers need to make really critical decisions. And think about decision makers, I think we can take it outside of the realm of politics here. We could be decision makers as lecturers, as administrators, etc. So the deliberative democracy requirement here would be that even some decisions that might be very critical and crucial, and maybe we don't have the time to consult with everyone who might be affected by it, at least at some point in time, we offer a justification which they can accept. If they were harmed by the consequences of decision, we offer redress and opening, opportunities in which we could remedy this. And so the way that this happens is sometimes researchers will be looking at unstructured communication in the public sphere across different online spaces, in the media, etc., protest, or they would actually create specific forums in which they kind of simulate the ideal conditions for what this ideal theory presents, that you should have number of ordinary people who would represent the population, who are given enough information to decide on these issues, and they have a very clear question. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this sounds like a great theory for democracy, or maybe not, or one where you have a few questions about, but how does that relate to algorithms? And we can think about all these different ways in which algorithms change it. So I looked at the use of artificial intelligence facilitators of conversations. And some of these conversations would be very critical, such as whether or not refugees who commit crimes in Switzerland should be repatriated, sent back, deported or not. And can you imagine that the person who would facilitate this conversation, the thing that would facilitate this conversation, is not even a person. It's a tool, it's an AI tool. And it's supposed to make people be able to understand that this is a very critical, very sensitive issue, one that is very easy to get into, like the tropes of racism and whatnot. And there's also the other side of it that, you would have people who are trying to highlight injustice, they would go online, they would try to post things, but their ways of trying to appeal to the algorithm doesn't get picked up, and so it would be buried. Or in fact, some platforms would actively suppress this content. Like for instance, in Myanmar, we've seen some of this against content that's in support of Palestinians as well. And so that's also another way in which algorithms impact deliberative democracy and this aspiration for including everyone to express what they think should be just or should be done to alleviate their condition. Now, other people have looked at this condition, this wider condition, in which, of course, it's one part of looking, or one way of looking at how society is kind of structured now. A lot more people are very curious about the climate crisis. They think that, in fact, we live in an anthropocentric climate crisis. It means that the change to the environment is led by human activity. We need to do something to change this. Others will be focused, like myself, will be focused on algorithms in the sense of how digital communication and life online has changed the way we do a lot of things. And most specifically, It's about the level of information and the number of data points that we've created about one person. Based on your education profile alone, maybe there will be applications to use this data for deciding on what kind of insurance you're eligible for, what kind of migration trajectories you'll have, what kind of job prospects you'll have, be it within the university context or beyond. And some other people will actually take it to another extreme, in which when you apply for jobs, they will request to look at your social media profiles and make a decision based on that. Or in fact, you'll be one of many people who are profiled because your social media profiles are publicly available, and they would create an ideal benchmark for who's a good candidate for this job, whatever the job might be. Of course, there's a lot of research done about how this perpetuates discrimination between people, that privileges certain profiles over others, and how this is unacceptable. So the notion of algocracy here is that society is governed by these logics, has two distinct features. One, that these are computer programmed algorithms, and the other one is that because of all the data that we have out there, it's only right, it's only adequate, and it's only possible to make all these decisions easier and make the most of the data that we have by having algorithms that can be programmed and run to do this analysis for us. Now, particularly in democracy, I've done work in which would say, actually, this is not a new problem. We've had this problem before. We've taken shortcuts before. And we look at other theorists who have looked at taking shortcuts in governing society and regulating public life. We have relied on experts. Sometimes we exclude people, the lived experiences, their stories and voices and considerations, and we just rely on experts. Sometimes it does yield good outcomes, other times it wasn't so successful. And so, thankfully, like, all this research and work was interesting enough to get the position at Murdoch, and I was asked to develop 3 new units. So now for this semester that's starting in end of February, I'm developing and teaching this unit called Politics, Society and Technology. And because it was really interesting to have the position as an opportunity to put the research and have my research in communication and in translation with education and building a new profile at Murdoch, in which we focus on things that might attract more students into university. Australia is kind of struggling in getting students in, and so is the idea that if we have things that are a bit more contemporary, things that are a bit more timely and relevant to personal experiences and daily life, that students will come in and they want to be more curious about it and learn about it. So you'll see that this is the list of topics that I have. I reordered them a little bit, but you'll see that this is the 3rd topic that I'll be presenting for the students and we're getting to discuss. So I was thinking about all of this in the background, and then I thought, you know what, it's actually really generous of you to have me today, so I'll actually focus on education, and let's see what the education literature, what I can learn from the education literature, and let's focus on that. Before I get back to Google, does anyone have any comments or questions about any of the things that we've talked about so far? Interventions or things that maybe... No, okay, we can, yes.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm just curious about one thing. My name is Ehsan. I'm from Faculty of Education. So I'm also from Philippines. And in the Bangsamoro government, they have what they call ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution. And although this concept of deliberative democracy is news to me, somehow I found it quite similar, because when they try to settle dispute before going to court, they try to use ADR first. And also, they also use ADR similarly when they are trying to implement some local changes in the local government. Is it similar to that, or?
I'm not very familiar with that particular mechanism, but it's very possible because, I mean, we have to make a distinction between deliberative democracy theory as the theorists kind of contribute to this body of knowledge, but also you have a lot of empirical researchers who would look at different practices and would say this is deliberation and it's democratic and this is how we should think about integrating it back into the theory for 2 reasons. One is that it's, in a way, democratizing the theory because we're bringing examples from how the community is practicing it rather than just what a German philosopher has dreamt back in the 80s or 70s and we're stuck there, because that's definitely not what deliberative democracy theorists are doing. And then the other part of it is to actually expand our understanding and categorization or recognition of a lot of these efforts. So it's very possible that it is a practice of deliberation. I don't know about the particular example, but I can tell you, for example, like another example that I've worked on and with in Tunisia. There was an environmental protection organization, and they did something called listening circles, in which they would take the weekly market as an opportunity for their village to come together and talk about, okay, what kind of environmental concerns do you have now? What can we bring back into like the local officials and whatnot? So again, maybe this is not what the theorists have imagined, but it's a practice that we would recognize as deliberative democracy and deliberation. Does that answer your question? Yes, great, thank you. Any other interventions before I get back to Google? All right, okay. If I have the liberty to, I had a request of the topics, but I'm more than happy to provide any of this material later on if it's not super readable, legible here. Now, I think when we're trying to think about the big picture, there's something kind of funny about using concepts or frameworks that are strictly within political science or governance literature, because we're trying to look at very specific ways in which institutions, citizens, states, private actors like companies interact, and maybe there's more into the mix. So try to think about not just the influence of Googling and Google on your decision making when you're trying to find things and you're trying to select where to go for dinner, which doctor to see next because you don't like your current doctor, etc., or which articles to read, etc., etc. But think about the cultural part of it. Google is kind of now a kernel in our culture. How many of you have used the verb Google? And it's never been a verb before. How many of you have used the phrase ask Dr. Google or don't ask Dr. Google? Exactly. And that's a work of culture. It's a frame of reference. Wherever you travel in the world, people will understand what you're talking about when you tell them don't ask Dr. Google. There is a common and shared understanding when we use these words. And I think going to algorithmic cultures and broadening that idea is a little bit more helpful when we're trying to understand things, and particularly the connections between disparate institutions or different sites of interactions and things that you could see a very clear connection, such as between education, work, and migration. So in works on algorithmic cultures, Ted Strappers is kind of one of the pioneers who've coined the term, and he tried to explain it in a few ways. In his earlier work in 2015, he looked at 3 ways in which we can understand algorithms. The etymological part of it, the word, which comes from Arabic, attributed to Al-Khwarizmi, who used to be a very famous mathematician, and thankfully algorithms were named back to him. And then crowd, the very idea that there is, when we are searching online and we find that some places are more popular or some sites are more reputable, etc., etc., we can kind of imagine that, oh my God, there is a number of other people like me who found this useful, so I'm part of this crowd. Even if you're not consciously thinking about it, that's kind of the dynamic in which it operates. And then finally, he tries to look at algorithms as a technical sorting system itself and the way it organizes a lot of these information and their influence. And one of the examples that I found really interesting is the power of keywords and how when you search for keywords in Google, for example, it does have a lot of organizational power and influence. It is something that it relates to our own priorities, but at the same time, you can see that other people have prioritized this as well. And you can see it in different iterations of Google search as well with predictive text. And now Google has integrated AI-generated main entries, and it's kind of really interesting, but the earlier iterations of that were not very accurate. Now they're getting slightly better, but honestly, any result that you get from there, I'll take it with a grain of salt, because you've got to make sure that the logic for how it's condensing this material, like different pages, probably the top pages and top search results into this AI-generated entry. Maybe it's a pastiche of the wrong information, or it's put in an order that's not accurate. But the other thing is that we also need to understand there is an argument for saying that algorithms are not just about internet cultures. It's not just about the world and society since the internet. It's something that have always existed in one way or another. The computational logic of it, the very idea that algorithms are designed as programs of if, do, then, and adding the input and output that you get based on these sequencing and the logics that go into it. This is something that has existed for a long time. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had the word algorithm, which comes from Algorithmic, who worked on this a long time ago. And so maybe it's possible to also broaden our understanding and not restrict it just to internet cultures, internet times, a society that's living online all the time. If a student achieves 50% of the score, then they succeed. That's an example of how education could have this algorithmic logic even without using any of the big computational computer-based models or big data about how many times do they click on the weekly topics in LMS or external links, etc., etc. So in a way, culture taps into a bigger frame of reference that's more accessible. It's not just restricted to modes of governance. And then when I started thinking about this idea, I was wondering which comes first, which is a subset of which. And I thought maybe actually we can think about culture as how the ideas, beliefs, imaginations, etc., inspire us to create the institutions, the modes of governance. And so you can have different institutions with different cultures. Maybe there's a dominant culture, and it's possible to have these two happening at the same time. This is a very sticky part in the research. I haven't really disentangled it yet, but I hope that there's something there that maybe we could work together. Is culture a precursor to governance, or is it a more recursive relationship? Maybe they feed into each other rather than exist in different times and different locations. But overall, I think reference or using cultures is a little bit more helpful in this sense, because we can talk about why is it that there is a pressure on educators to embrace AI tools, to be industry ready, to develop skill set for students that are ready for finding jobs, and like the different competition between universities based on what kind of jobs and prospects they have after they graduate. So this is a cultural thing. It's not necessarily just governance. Of course, it's supported sometimes with governance when there's government incentives or scholarships or industry placements, but that's not always, maybe one follows the next rather than governance created the, sorry, now that I say this out loud, maybe it's governance that created the culture, or maybe the culture has created, like in reverse, has created these governance opportunities. So like I mentioned earlier, we can see these algorithmic logics and culture in education in some ways, particularly in terms of their social relevance and influence. In education, students are, this is mainstream educational institutions, grading and classification of students' performance and their university life is often based on categories of better or worse. How does this student perform if you're grading against a curve in this university or others? How does this particular student perform against the distribution of grades for the whole class? That is one way of categories of better and worse. How did this cohort perform compared to the one before them? Grades inflation, and all of these dynamics are ways of, again, purporting social relevance and ranking. Once you exit the institution, it's not about what you learned, it's not about what you gained, it's not about how refined you are as a person anymore. It's about how reputable is your institution, how good your grades are, how do you rank against other people. University rankings is something that's also a factor that students take into consideration. So when we think about that, and we think about the algorithmic logic of the student experience itself in terms of the pedagogy that's about seeing the causal relationships between inputs, which is what you're teaching, your approaches, the material that you're using, and the outputs, how well did they do, the grades they got, if they graduated or not. we can think about how this is also another way of algorithmic logics that are about enforcing certain hierarchies, even if the intention of education is equalizing or offering ways of social mobility. Again, a very sticky part of this research, but I'm still thinking through it, so this is where I'm at now. When we look at the implications of this, and particularly in a broader context of the algorithmic cultures in which there is a pressure on educators, educators have been asked to embrace new digital technologies and new tools for communication and integrate that, make your education more innovative, more engaging, more cool. I don't know what the words would be, but you get these requests time and time again. And maybe that does create a little bit of leeway in designing a teaching experience in which it's not just about inputs and outputs. But at the same time, if we have this pacing problem that some people could be left behind because they're not keeping up with the technologies, and because some schools are richer, some universities are richer, others are not as well resourced, how could education and educational institutions and educators be able to commit to this mission if they do have the aspiration for education for equalizing or enabling a new opportunity? So again, there's a way, it's not to portray it as dual-sided, but it's just that it's a very complicated and very sticky situation. On the one hand, you have an external culture that's pressuring education to function in a way that would service the industry. And then you have an industry who's always changing, trying to do really ridiculous things that are not really connected to particular projects. If the industry's driver is, there's an economic benefit out of it, there's profit, there is just developing technologies for the sake of it, rather than thinking about maybe good applications or bad applications, applications in peace, applications in war. You can think about all different things. They don't really consider that in as much the economic calculation, versus educational institutions that maybe would have different objectives. Maybe they want to have a pedagogical project, maybe they want to have a social project, a philosophical one, maybe political. I know party politics are not as influential anymore, and we don't have student unions that are organized around parties anymore, but there could be political projects such as alleviation of poverty or climate change responses and adaptation, etc. So this pressure, what it does is not only just to make lives of lecturers and educators difficult, make students unable to actually go into universities to explore and find and learn more about themselves as well as their community and their peers, but it also is changing the nature of what the purpose of education is. And this is a really interesting part of the education literature that I was reading, and I was particularly inspired by the work of Luhmann and Schor. And as sociologists of education, they say the purpose of education is to imagine what other perspectives others may hold, even if you don't know enough about them. And that's really powerful. This is holding education and the responsibility for education, that you can hold the interest and the well-being and welfare of others because you know a little bit more than others do. Now, we can think about the implications of what happens after you get out of the university context in terms of work and migration patterns. One, that this is an incomplete sentence. One, that there are algorithmic logics in operation in terms of assessing qualification and desirability. Think about, for example, big United Nations programs that take graduates in. Not only that you see the visible rankings in which some nationals of certain countries are allowed into the program, but there are even more internal hierarchies within. Which universities did you go to? Who are your references? Do you have a connection? Do you know someone who works inside the organization? And some of these are clear, they're transparently listed on the websites and internships, others are not. And then on the other hand, it's also that they need to respond to these economic logics and the tech industry's demands. And so we can see this in terms of, for educators, it's this emphasis that we need to have students who graduate or graduates who have skills based on tech fluency and competitiveness. It's not about the educational, it's not based on an education or a pedagogical benchmark anymore. It's based on how they're going to contribute to the economy. And I think this is a reality now. The very idea that a lot of students, they calculate their decision which programs to enlist in, which universities to go to, not only just based on their own economic reality in the present and that moment in which they're applying and considering, but also in the future, can they project that they will have a better economic outcome based on this educational experience or time invested in education, again, more economic terms, than anything about the quality of the experience itself. And so we can also see that it does have really serious implications for having a workforce that is exploited, particularly with tech applications and AI, if you're interested in that. The two examples in which the tech companies based in Silicon Valley, Hong Kong, you name it, will be concentrating all the big brains who are developing the technologies, the software, the hardware, and the big ideas at some point. But then the majority world, or the developing world in some other references, will be providing the raw materials, including human labor. We're supporting with the resources that create the hardware for this. The resources are mined, but also human labor is not well compensated, even though these workers are doing something that's very essential to the functioning of these technologies. In the case of AI particularly, you will have workers that are training and refining and filtering AI models, large language models such as ChatGPT from OpenAI, if you're using that. And this is mainly done by workers in Kenya. If you spend time on Facebook and you don't see any disturbing content or content in which people are being harmed, that's because there are people in the Philippines who are working in data centers, and their only job is to actually go through all this bad content that's been flagged to filter it. Their job is called the cleaners, and they make these online spaces sanitized for us. So it's work that's very important, work that's very essential, but it's in fact based on exploitation. And these tech companies, they don't share the profits with these workers. And it creates, again, a dependency between the South and the North, majority and minority worlds, based on exploitation and not having equal access to what economic benefit comes from these technologies. On top of all this, if this was not grim enough, there is also the threat of brain drain. People who are highly talented, highly skilled, and very creative in some of these highly desired tech development areas, they're more likely to leave to the minority world where there's concentration of wealth and investment, etc., in these industries, leaving the majority world, the rest of us, behind. But also what's really interesting, particularly for AI alone, I don't know if other sectors, they experience something similar. Within the minority world itself, they're also afraid about the implications of brain drain. You see a lot more people leaving the EU, particularly those who are in fields related to AI and tech development, going to the US because the EU is ahead in terms of regulation, but not as ahead in terms of incubating these innovations. And in fact, some people make the argument is because the sector is so heavily regulated in the EU compared to the US that companies deliberately leave the EU. They don't mind complying with users' rights in the EU, but they think the restrictions are far too limiting of their innovations to stay in the EU. I think this is a pause here before I get into the case. So maybe I'll stop talking for a second and I'll start listening to you. Any thoughts, any questions, any interventions, or maybe something that is a little bit far-fetched and not super relevant to maybe you're experiencing? Yeah, sorry, yeah, should I go, or is it?
Thank you so much. So I'm very interested in the aspect that you mentioned that some of the peripheral countries are being used as labor market, or take advantage of. But do you know CAS, like the Conrad? In Philippines, there's a NGO organization based on Germany. I forgot the full name, but the first name is Conrad. And what they do is they try to promote prompt engineering. So what they do is that they realize that the Filipinos are really heavily relying on AI nowadays. So instead of dissuading them from using AI, they instead promoted the concept of prompt engineering. So my friend, right now, he has attended like a 2 week seminar. What do you call this? Sponsored by Germany. That NGO, and they also try to promote or equate the use of prompt engineering with leadership training as well, because in order to what do you call this? In order to really uh, make the people adapt, because otherwise people will be left behind if they fail to go with the flow. Like some people who resisted industrialization got left behind and something like that. So they are afraid that if they get left behind, they will be able to. So the thing is, when it comes to the brain drain and the rise of virtual assistant job in Philippines, so they actually try to dissuade the people from entering the corporate market in the Philippines and instead work for US or work for other companies as part of the content moderation that you have mentioned, like the TikTok, the Meta, something like that. So do you think? So my question goes now: is it a good idea to teach like elementary and high school students about prompt engineering, because they are actually using it now more than the college students and postgraduate students?
Absolutely. It's Ehsan, right? Thank you so much. That was really great. And actually, the case that I'll present here, these children or young people, actually not all of them are children, they do mention some things about teaching AI in schools. But just on the point of, is it a good idea or not? I think, because again, this is not really my expertise, but I think from my place as someone who's really familiar with deliberative democracy, I think the idea is that I shouldn't dictate what is a good policy, what is a good direction, what's not, but it's about enabling different communities and societies to actually decide that for themselves and have them linked with particular, let's say, decision-making opportunities or opportunities in which they can exert influence on power to have these recommendations and directions followed through. So I personally wouldn't recommend, because I think it would differ from one country to the next, right? I just wanted to clarify a little bit of, I think it's a bit of a slippage between the brain drain point and then the work skill set that's based on tech fluency. I think there are two distinct features. If you're based in the Philippines, but recruited by Meta, by the Facebook company, for example, you don't get paid the same rates as someone who's based in the US. And in fact, some of these jobs don't even exist in the US because they don't want to pay that kind of money to someone in the US. And that is a different kind of dynamic. If you look at the global politics and the world, more broadly speaking, it's a very different dynamic when you have a lot of people who are getting paid, very little money, $100 a month. Maybe this is a lot of money for someone who's living in the Philippines, but $100 in a month in the US is nothing. And this, again, extends the power and the influence and the investment opportunities and the money that companies like Meta can have to keep expanding their tech while using what they would think is an economically rational choice to use labor and workers who are not paid as much as anywhere else in the world. And that's different from the brain drain point, where brain drain is actually more focused on the people and the, let's say, like cohorts of people who would be very, very highly specialized and skilled, that they would be hunted by big executives or would be leading different teams and whatnot, but not in their home countries. That's the whole idea, that they actually leave the country and they get integrated with the corporations home-based, or maybe they're moved to another. So Meta, for example, has a location in Ireland. Or actually, I think they did limit their operations in Ireland for the EU compliance point, but they would be sent to another hub that's influential, so they're not based in their home countries. Just to clarify the distinction between these two. With prompt engineering, is anyone not familiar with what prompt engineering is? I show nods? Okay. So if you have used any AI virtual assistant, I shouldn't say AI because it's a conversation for another time, we can have that a bit later. But if you've used any assistant chatbots, and particularly ones that are based on large language models, meaning that they've analyzed very big sets of human language and they've understood how, or they're trained to understand how human communication operates, and it can send you back something that looks naturalistic enough that you would think a human wrote it. Sometimes people think it's even better than a human writing it. To actually get to that result, it's not a very straightforward and simple thing. You need to write a prompt, which is what you're asking the assistant to do, and you need to ask it in a very specific language, in a very specific fashion, an order of words and instructions to make sure that you get the result that you want. So as a student and you want the virtual assistant to help you summarizing an article that you're reading, for example, you need to give it very specific instructions on what your discipline is, on what kind of summary you want, how you want to find, like, for example, tell it, I need to find a research question and the argument and the conclusion. And this is the kind of summarization and instruction logic that the Google AI assistant would give you, the AI generated search result. Someone would have engineered how the search result should be summarized. So for people who are using AI in applications, be it to digital marketing or any sort of some people who have jobs as virtual personal assistants, they also use AI extensively. They would be getting training in such thing that is prompt engineering to maximize the results. And on the point of culture, the final thing before I move on to the case, is actually you have a lot of influencers and a lot of people who are making money just by telling you, you need to get on the AI hype, you need to get rich on AI, you don't need to fall back, you can be rich if you follow these things that I'm telling you to do. And they would claim that they're millionaires, but do we actually know that they're millionaires? Very doubtful. So it's really interesting to see a lot of this content. I find as a researcher in terms of studying the cultural influence of it, everyone wants to be a millionaire, everyone thinks that AI is going to make them a millionaire. And so you would find people who are actually capitalizing on this, they're smarter, they could see it 2 steps ahead, and they think, you know what, I'm going to give you the training that will make you more money than you are now because you don't want to miss out on this thing that is AI. Yes.
I just want to ask a final sentence in the, in the final sentence in the your PowerPoint about the brain drain from the majority word as well as within the minority word, and then you mentioned about Europe and US. Which mobilization is it from the majority word? Which country do you mean? And then the minority word, which country do you mean? Thank you.
Absolutely. So the more classical, like majority and minority world, are more recent classifications to try to explain other ways in which we refer. So instead of using the categories of first, second, third world, which some people would use it in an economic sense, but it's actually more connected to which countries have joined forces in World War II. This is a categorization, like the first world was the US, the UK, and France, I think. And then the second world were the Soviet bloc, they joined later. And then the third world was basically the majority of the world, they joined much later. And so that's how countries such as Egypt, Indonesia, Brazil, they became known third world countries. We often use it now culturally as less developed or developing, but it's actually a reference to when they joined the forces and the alliances in the war. Now, developing, least developed, developed, developing, developed, these are all different categories as well that don't recognize that the developed world is actually based on the exploitation of all the rest of the world again. So the majority and the minority world comes as a categorization that recognizes the power imbalance and some of this history to it as well. Most of the world's wealth and influence is concentrated in a minority, and that is the EU, the US, the global north, if you may call it so. And then the majority of the world is the majority of the world's population, but it doesn't have the world's majority wealth or influence. And so these categories are becoming to be more relevant now. A lot more people are preferring to use these rather than the previous categories, be it third world or developing or developed. I'm not sure, maybe there's some other categorizations out there, but this is the most recent. Global, South and North, absolutely. Yes, no, sorry, the majority. Yes, so the typical migration trajectories is from the majority world to the minority. But what we're seeing with AI specifically is even more interesting because people are leaving, like there's this brain drain within the minority world itself. People in the EU who are software developers or AI developers and engineers or even nuclear engineers, etc., they're leaving the EU and going to the US. So it's a different kind of dynamic. If you think that there's huge disparity between for example, the AI trainers in Kenya and the cleaners in the Philippines, if that's a disparity, there's even another level of disparity in terms of the skilled expertise. So the US is becoming a lot more the center for development and having this highly skilled individuals there. And I say we see this specifically with AI just because I'm not across other industries. Maybe it is possible that we're seeing the same phenomenon with other industries, but in AI it's definitely the case that there is a concentration in the US.
Thank you, Nadine. A lot of things I feel lost sometimes the conversation. The discussion is not, within my expertise. But then you're talking about the pressure on educators to adapt. I would like to hear more about what you meant by putting this information, keeping up with the pace, economy and tech, versus you have a number of things that probably hard to pronounce. Pedagogical or pedagogical. We were like debating which one is correct. But so would you please discuss with us what do you mean by that point?
Absolutely. Actually, I might just hold you for a second there. Maybe you can help me out with this. If the subject of education is knowledge building, knowledge transfer, skills building, etc., is it because it makes us money? Or is it because maybe it does something else in society, like thinking particularly in society? So what I'm saying is that you could actually think about the pedagogical part of it, which is what kind of knowledge-specific or discipline-specific or skill-specific training from a pedagogical perspective in terms of the learning, the ways of learning, the ways of teaching, the ways of acquiring knowledge and transferring it. Or maybe something more social, because in a society in which a lot more people could actually do well if they're more educated, so that would be the purpose of education. There are different directions pedagogically speaking. So you have, I'm not sure if there's a purist pedagogical tradition, but I'm familiar with the social justice pedagogy, okay, I'm tripping on the word now. Pedagogy, no, that doesn't sound right. Pedagogical directions, let's stick with that one. Which means that the way that you approach your teaching and teaching methods and the kind of selections that you're making is to make students aware of social injustice and the different ways in which they could use the knowledge that they have and the skills that they've learned in trying to be aware of it and address it. Maybe they don't get the job in which they could do this because there's so many systems, we can't expect one individual to change everything, but at least this is the approach you're taking when you're teaching. And maybe the social part of it as well could be on the university level or the school level, in which the university or the school sees itself having a more social, like a bigger role in society, be it social or political. So socially, maybe this is places for alternative learning, so people will come in and attend classes or come to lectures and discussions, but not necessarily to get a degree, it's just to be better members of the community. Maybe lecturers go out and students go out into the community to do practical things. So these would be different versions of these kind of projects. Maybe it's philosophical, maybe it's something about, just understanding like what is the purpose of knowledge, why do we value knowledge, why do we have these institutions, what we take of it. And I just think that the version of education that we will have when we focus on these priorities, or if we have these aspirations, will look very different from the current model that we have, which I think, and I could be wrong, which is more focused on the economic, keeping up with the economic prospects and keeping up with the technology. There's always this anxiety, and it's very possible it's a bias because I'm researching this area, that there's always this anxiety that we're not doing enough in terms of getting students to be ready for what's happening out there in the world in terms of technology. Does that clarify? All right, thank you. Any other thoughts before I present the, share with you the project that happened in Ireland? Yeah, okay. Right, so I did mention earlier that I work primarily in deliberative democracy, and I mentioned two ways in which we could see deliberative democracy in practice. One is structured, which means that you will have people who will commission a space and time and try to do recruitment to get citizens together, give them information, give them access to experts, so they could have their questions about a specific policy or a specific concern or issue. And sometimes it's a little bit more broader than that, but I can talk about this later. And then also access to the politicians or the policymakers. So in a way, you make sure that these people, their time is not just talk, it's not empty talk. There's actually something of effect that's going to happen. And so in Ireland, they have actually institutionalized that. It's an officially recognized institution after too many experiments. They had a very successful outcome with amending the constitution, and they have decided that they want to keep this model. So their model for citizens that are above 18 is based on getting 100 randomly selected citizens, and they set through deliberations over a number of days, and whatever the government is discussing and the government wants to hear from citizens, this assembly gets together. Now in 2022, they did something that was very interesting and something that is exceptional in terms of deliberations on AI. I'm currently on a project, I have a paper project in which I'm looking at 6 cases of citizen deliberations. This is one of them, and this is the only one that is focused on young people. It's really interesting. And so in a day, which is not a lot of time, 41 young people between the ages of 12 and 24 were selected to participate in deliberations on AI in Ireland and the future of AI in Ireland. Now, a portion of these young people were randomly selected from the general population, and about 26 of them, it was about an even split, about 26 of them were selected from organizations that do a lot of advocacy related to young people in Ireland. And they were organized to participate in forced trans. Their job, it's such a big topic to look at AI and what the Irish government should do in terms of AI governance. So they've organized them to be in discussion groups across 4 strands. The first one is on AI in society. The second is on governance ecosystem to promote trustworthy AI. Trustworthy AI is a very particular governance question in the UK, but you can see it, some companies also have this concern, and some research institutes are focused on trustworthy AI. And then the third one is called Serving the Public, was on AI and serving the public, and then the final one is on education, skills, and talent. What I find really fascinating in the report on this youth assembly is that out of 12 recommendations, 4 were in education. No other area had 4 recommendations. They mostly had 2 at most, which really means that young people, like their experiences with education, what they think of education in relation to AI is very, very important. And I think it's also, it's kind of a very bureaucratic thing to lump together education, skills and talent, because we're thinking about what happens after you're done with education, right? You get into the universities to be ready to be a part of the economy right away as a worker. So what do these recommendations look like? I'll just focus on the concerns, not to be negative, but just to show you, just to make the argument for, to make my argument a little bit clearer. Now, there was a lot of optimism actually, like in the report, there's a lot of optimism about what kind of opportunities AI present. And they were all very dreamy. They were imagining a future in which, for example, if the concern at the bottom here, loss of jobs, actually, if we automate and give AI dangerous jobs, menial jobs, jobs that are not dignifying, and we give that to the machines, and you lose that job, the government will be able to make a universal basic income. So it's actually a really interesting way that they were very optimistic about it, but they were aware of the consequences of it. Don't just automate jobs and get people to lose their jobs without providing an alternative. And I thought this was very powerful. But in terms of the concerns, and I think this kind of illuminates some of the things that I discussed earlier in terms of pressure on educators. So these young people, they've highlighted that they think maybe there will be a divide between private and public schools because of resources and access, and this is a very valid concern. And I think we can see it, the most affluent school. Even a machine is telling me I've been talking for too long. Sorry. There we go. Is this working now? Oh, yes, perfect. All right, great. So they were afraid that there will be a resource gap between private and public universities, and this is within the context of Ireland. They're not talking about the rest of the world, but we can see some of these concerns resonating with other places too. They're concerned that they're not going to... Oh. Is that a little bit louder? Yep, okay. They were also concerned that teachers might not be trained in AI, and they think, implicitly what this says is that they think it's the teacher's job to teach them and train them in AI, right? And again, this comes with this second concern, the following concern, which is teachers not understanding what AI is or utilizing it. Particularly, and quote from the recommendations in the report, it's a fear of falling behind or feeling left out. So again, this idea of divides, this idea that in the school context as a young person, and I can assume as well because the age bracket is a bit higher than 18, in the university context, there is this anxiety that all these cultural references around you that the world is about AI, the world is about being algorithmically aware, etc., etc. If you don't have the time in your educational institutions to explore this and learn about it and be a part of it, you're going to be left out. The future for you is going to look a little bit grim. And then finally, they were also concerned, and I thought this was really interesting too, that not all students will find AI engaging or worthwhile learning in the manner being taught, which is a reflection that maybe the educational system is not living up to their expectation. And I do have a colleague who said, who are students to judge the quality of my knowledge because they don't know anything yet? And I thought this was really interesting. So to what extent do we have this flexibility between being student-centric and student-led, but also trying to understand where such concerns come from? Why is it that young people would think that as students they're not learning the right way? Is it because there's so many YouTubers who are sitting online for 10 to 15 to 30, sometimes to an hour, talking about different topics that we discuss in school, or is there something else going on about the purpose of education and what an educational institution does? And this goes back to the point we just discussed about the difference between an education that is based on economic and tech-ready logics and education that is based on something else that's more deeper and not just tenuous with short-term changing priorities for profit. So it's a really interesting experience. I'll go back to Hassan's point as well in terms of the question he posed for me, do I think it's a good idea to teach prompt engineering? And the answer is get whoever is concerned about this and get them to discuss it and get them to understand all the different aspects of it. You know, that there are workers who are cleaning up these systems, that they're training the models, there's environmental implications for it, there is cognitive implications for it, the way we use AI could change our psyche in positive and negative ways, and let people be aware of all these different aspects, talk to experts, talk to the people who are concerned about this, and whatever they decide then is a good idea to start with. But here is my argument. I want to add another layer to it. which is put the future in the center of these conversations. I think it's a normative argument. It's one that sets an ideal. It's like, if you want to have these conversations, put the future in the center of it. Think about what kind of future am I making? What kind of future do we want to make if we're making these decisions now about using AI or being part of this, being influenced by this algorithmic culture in one way or another. And for that, and I base this on a work in deliberative democracy by Mansbridge and colleagues, there is a democratic benefit to it, which is the inclusivity of all. In a report that was published by a UK organization called Connected by Data, they made a very interesting storyline, which is a cattle herder in India is affected by decisions on AI just as much as a software development lead in Silicon Valley. And one time when I presented work in which the bigger set in which the Irish example was part of, I had a question from the audience: what would someone in very rural, very isolated parts of Western Australia have to say about AI? And I was like, they should be included, they should be a part of the conversation, because they can tell us about what life without AI is like. And maybe this is something worth hearing, because they're going to be affected by it even if they don't use it right away. It could be ways in which we can't imagine, because we don't have that experience of living without AI or being so isolated that even AI can promise to bring millions into my bank account one day if I understand how to use it. This person doesn't even know that it's possible. It doesn't even know that this is something that is out there in the world. It's also ethical. And here, not only that it's ethical to include people in decisions that will affect them, but I think we could borrow on from the literature on sustainable development and indigenous knowledges, which was published in the International Institute for Sustainable Development in 1992. And it was titled A Responsibility for the Seventh Generation. In climate research, the idea, in climate research in connection with indigenous knowledges, the idea is that indigenous knowledges tell us that and indigenous people tell us that the decisions we make today will have implications that can extend to 7 generations, and so we're responsible for them. And finally, it's epistemic. It's also about what we know. The example of the person living in India that's very isolated, someone who's not at the center of these conversations, is just as important as someone who is. So the 7th generation is an idea that comes from research on climate change and in connection to indigenous knowledges and indigenous communities. And the idea is that in North America, like that's including Canada and the US, but mainly in Canada, as well as elsewhere in the world, in conversations about their experience with climate change and their ways of adapting, they made the argument that in fact, ruthless capitalism, ruthless profit-seeking developments and whatnot has challenged the ways in which indigenous keepers have looked after the land and the environment. And so their argument is that decisions that you make today will have implications for 7 generations, and so you're responsible for them. You need to keep in mind 7 generations of people to come, not just you now making the most buck for you, not making the most money and leaving out what's going to happen in the future. So for example, IKEA is farming forests. I don't remember which country it was, but basically they're growing trees to chop them down to make IKEA furniture. But then if you keep doing this, it must be unsustainable at a certain level. And what does the implication of this kind of practice, as well as other practices, for 7 generations to come? Are they going to have the forest and trees, or are they going to live with a very tired piece of land that can't bear trees anymore, can't give life to trees anymore? So that's the logic of the 7th generation. And I think it's exactly that. What we do now shouldn't be just for our benefit just now, it should be for the benefit of 7 generations to come. And I think it's something that research on AI and people interested in AI policy and governance can learn from. It's something that is possible, particularly because of the connection as well to the climate implications of AI users. They're very resource intensive and they're very straining. The amount of water that they use to cool down the data centers and the training the data centers that house the training models where they're run is extensive. Every time you use ChatGPT, it's like drinking a glass of water. That's how. So if you use it 3 times in a day, that's 3 glasses of water that you're pouring down. So that's the kind of the environmental implication for using AI. So finally, I think this is the end of it. Oh, sorry. Good question. I'm not sure I've read anything about recycled water, but it would be good to look into it. I don't think so because it's quite wasteful. So with cryptocurrency, for example, because they have a similar resource demand, some people have experimented with building greenhouses so that the heat will just be used to incubate plants. But I don't know if OpenAI has recycled water. Netflix had a similar problem actually. So they would say, oh, like our models and our streaming services, we use X percentage of renewable resources. It was a very small percentage. And in fact, when you looked at it, it was quite wasteful in the sense that they weren't utilizing it to the most. So it's kind of a greenwashing, but it's a really good point. I'll look into it. Yeah, thank you. Finally, I'm just going to go back to the Irish example for a second because I think there's an empirical approach to it. I'm not going to do it empirically. I think I'm going to focus, when I develop this into an article, I'm going to focus on the normative argument. But if we want empirical support, from the Irish example, for instance, the report summarizes that young people are actually very, very happy to discuss the future of AI. This was something that was meaningful to them. It was particularly focused on that. And you could say that maybe they were influenced by, oh, I think there's something missing here. Yep, so there's something missing. You could probably say that they were inspired by the kind of questions, the engagement questions that they were given in preparation for the assembly. And you're right, 2 out of 20 questions that were given to them were phrased about the future. But there are different testimonies from young people that have participated in some of the videos that they've created in which they actually emphasize the whole idea of the future. So the democratic, the ethical, and the epistemic values of thinking about the future in some of these conversations might have empirical bases just as normative appeal. So finally, I'd like to think this is the full picture, this is the very start of the journey, this is how I'm thinking about the paper now and focusing on this very idea that if we start focusing on doing conversations about AI and its role in education, we should start with talking with people who are going to be affected by it, but we should also bring them to think about the future. There's something about having the future in our minds and at the center of these conversations that changes the way we prioritize and think about our preferences. So I'd like to give it back to you now and tell me, what do you think? Do you think is there a value in there? Is there something else that we should consider? Is it that we just need to play catch up and keeping pace with whatever the industry is dictating and we respond to what the industry wants from our students and our teaching? Or maybe there's a completely different kind of alternative that we can imagine. Thank you.
Thank you very much for insightful presentation, Nordin. So I guess you still have many questions. Let's dive into Q&A session again. So this is your opportunity to engage directly to the speaker. So please, anyone who wanna ask question or share your thought, raise your hand.
So I'm just going to repeat the question again to make sure I understood it correctly. With this experiment of the Ministry of Education creating the model experience, the idea is to roll out AI and get the students to participate without parents' knowledge that they're going to be participants in. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So on that point of resources and facilities, that's a very good question, but I'll park that for a second. I'll hold off that for a second. To get back to your initial question, I think, so are children able to understand and participate in some way or another? I think yes. There are some experiments with deliberations in school. I would recommend looking at the works of Kei Nishiyama, who's, I think his book is coming out this year. And so he works on this very idea that we should recognize children as current citizens, not future citizens, because they are a part of society and we shouldn't deny their agency completely. Of course, there are the legal implications of what does it mean that they can't legally consent and you need the parents' consent to it and whatnot. And I think that's also something that maybe someone who's an expert in Indonesian law might be able to respond to better. But in terms of containing this to the idea that is it possible to have children part of these conversations and they could be aware of what's, just as you teach them about AI and you want them to be a part of this, you might be able to also explain to them why is it that they're learning it, what is the benefit of it, etc., etc. So if you go back to the principle of justification, I think everyone, so long you can understand and you can respond to it, should be able to afford that. There are different ways of looking at it. Like everyone should be afforded a justification, including children. Now, on the point of resources and parents, so there's a knowledge gap on the level of parents and there's a knowledge gap on the level of teachers. And maybe this is something that the conversations around the pilot program should have. You don't want to leave the children behind from this hypothetical future, but you're leaving behind the parents and you're leaving behind the teachers who are supposedly the ones who are holding the children's hands into this future. So that doesn't sound like a very complete picture of what this future is. So again, back to my argument, it's like, what is this future? What is it for? Who is it including? Who is it excluding? These are all the kind of questions that need to be explored when devising big strategies, big plans, etc. I hope that responds to your question. Thank you. Sorry. Exactly.
Okay. Thank you, Nadine. So I just wondering that when this kind of technology offering to the whole of the world, so it's meaning that developing countries like us, so it's more dependent and more become absolute dependent to what should we do in the context of, for example, challenging the developed countries, giving a fresh ID, which it could be alternative, it could be what we call as to get more resources that are available to us. Okay, what is your comment about it?
Absolutely, thank you. That is a really good question, actually. And I think there's hope. Like, I think it really depends, and it comes back to political will. Do heads of states, do they want to appease and appeal to the corporations and the companies and don't regulate them? Or do they actually want to make a stand and make sure that people's rights and well-being is protected? And a recent example of this is that Brazil has asked Twitter, it's either that they strengthen their content moderation or they're not going to be accessible in Brazil anymore. Elon Musk said, like, oh, Brazil, we can do without Brazil, even though it's a really big country with a huge user base in Brazil. And after negotiations and back and forth, actually, Elon Musk came around and accepted their terms, the government's terms, because the government wouldn't, like he was trying to scare them off and say, I'm very influential, more influential than the whole state. But Brazil, the government stood their ground and they said, this is the way we want to see it, this is the way that's going to happen, and he finally accepted. So there's hope. There's some good examples, but the many bad examples make it a bit more difficult to have faith that Brazil would be the model rather than the exception. So I hope it is the model, it's not the exception.
I would like to ask the threat in the AI itself, because as already said that there are also some threats, of course, related with the defense security and so on. For example, when I talk with my friends and then somehow it came up on my Instagram, although I haven't tried it on it or search on it on my phone, but it happened. Maybe you can elaborate us more about the threat so we can be more flexible.
Thank you. That's one of my favorite examples, actually, like that when you're just discussing something and it pops up. I don't study one specific platform or one specific algorithm. Like I'm more a bit broader. I try to take a bigger picture. But when I read about these examples, it was really interesting. A lot of people, because of how quickly it happens, they think that their phones are spying on them. Now, recent evidence suggests that iPhones, yes, Siri was spying on some people, but not everyone, which is really unfortunate and a huge breach of privacy. But that particular example you're talking about is actually more that has to do with personalization and recommendation algorithms. Again, not an expert on this, but I'll tell you what I understand from what I read and looked at. And the idea is that, so most phones, most websites, most browsers and apps, if you don't read the terms and conditions, you will find in the you wouldn't know about this, but it's in the terms and conditions that there is data sharing between apps. And so if you have searched something at some point in your browser, it's actually connected to the other apps that you're using on your phone. And sometimes if you have your browser on your laptop linked to your browser on your phone, this data is connected as well. So what you look up on your laptop, even if you think that, I'm doing it incognito in private mode, there's no way that this is going to pick it up. Some of the browsers are not very strict about this and they still store it. So what happens is that you have personalization algorithms, so they keep track of all the things that you're looking at, all the things that you're clicking through, but also predictive algorithms. They can predict and nominate and recommend other things that you might find interesting based on the other stuff that you have looked at before. And that's why when you start talking about something, you see it right away because you might have looked at something very similar to it or not. There's a really famous case, it was a few years ago, in which this woman, I don't remember exactly where she was living, but she was really upset that for a period of time, every time that she's on Facebook, it would keep recommending baby stuff, clothes, gadgets, tools, and whatnot. And she was like, I'm not even pregnant, I don't even consider having children, like why is Facebook recommending all of this for me? And it was a very random, tenuous connection that she clicked on the photos of someone who recently had a baby, and so the algorithm thought that she's had the baby, something along these lines. But that's the extent of how the tracking goes and how it gives you recommendations on that. So it might have been something that happened to your friend. I don't know, I'm assuming. What is really interesting in my field in terms of these algorithms is that when you have movements that are trying to make big political claims, they want to make sure that a lot of people are aware of the work that they're doing and whatnot. What they do in terms of online mobilization is that they would reverse engineer what the algorithm favors and what the algorithm privileges and what the algorithm likes and rewards. And so based on that, they will start making shorts or videos or TikToks that appeal to the logic of the algorithm. They would try to create and generate content that again appeals to the algorithm so that they could get high visibility. So if you remember, I think it was, so it happened in two cases with solidarity with Uyghur people in China and then in solidarity with people in Palestine recently. People would do a get ready with me videos, but they would actually, so they would be doing their faces and whatnot, but they would be talking about the wars or the exploitation and the forced labor camps in China. And that was a way to trick the algorithm, but also get visibility because the algorithm then was rewarding these types of videos, the get ready with me videos. So these are really interesting ways in which people are becoming algorithm aware. That's some of the concepts that have been developed to explain this. And young people, political actors, in fact, it's used also on the flip side for political manipulation and campaigning by using reverse engineering how the algorithm works and designing content in ways that would get to most people. So on the nefarious manipulative side, of course, you see communication and misinformation about health, about crises, about political outcomes, about integrity issues, which also has devastating impacts just as much as playing the algorithm on the other side may have a more democratic effect by getting more people to know about these injustices in the world. I hope this answers your question, but my advice would be not only just to try to understand how make the algorithm work for your benefit, make sure that you try to understand what the logic is. That is a very powerful thing, be it when you're on social media or using Google or other browsers. And the other thing is that try to increase your awareness of how to keep your data private. Don't give your real email address easily, your phone numbers. If you sign up to services, make sure that they don't share it with other companies because they sell this data and then you get spammed. And again, that could be a way in which you're getting targeted as well. Just general cybersecurity literacy stuff is also very useful. I don't have a toolkit at hand, but I'm happy to share resources if any of these specific things are interesting to you. I'm happy to take the time to create a list for things to look at.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe you still have many questions and curiosity, but time's up, everyone. Thank you very much, Nardine. It's truly fascinating to see how algorithmic culture has a significant role in education, work, and migration. And also, thank you very much for your active participations, audience. See you and good afternoon, everyone. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.